Hey everyone, Duke Nukem 3D here with another video for you guys, and this one is going to be a more historically focused video rather than a review or just a general discussion or just a review on a typical type or a certain type of mask. Again, this is going to be more of a in-depth discussion on gas mask development in history, and that is why did the AT fail and what was really the best mask of the First World War. So the point of this review, I'm just going to be talking about the logical design features that were implemented in the Akron TISO series masks and sort of debating why all, because it's really pretty widely known at this point that the AT is the mask that I obsess the most about. It's my most favorite mask in pretty much all of history, pretty much. God dang it, I can't talk today. But anyways, I'm going to be discussing why fundamentally and why physically it was why I consider it to be the best mask, and if it was, there's a few specific features that sets it apart from all other masks in its era, and sort of discussing why it lost out to its eventual adversary, and just kind of go from there. And I should note that I'm not really going to be referencing the Type A Akron TISO as much as the Type B. If you want to know the difference between the Type A and the Type B, you can check out my posts in the AEF gas mask thread on the U.S. Military Forum, or check out any of my previous AT reviews. But I'm mostly going to be talking about the Type B when I reference the AT. I just have the Type A here just for completency of, or completance, whatever the word is, if that's even a word, of the mask series. And unfortunately, I do not have a Cops TISO and Monroe mask. I don't even have a Burrell Cops type, which is the stockinette version. I do have an M1A1, which is a close enough placeholder to use as example, as many of the features of the Cops TISO and Monroe were implemented on the later M1 series, but I digress. So, the Type B Akron TISO, it was by far probably the most modern and well-rounded design of the First World War for many reasons. Obviously, the mask was made of a solidly molded one piece, no seams, no vulcanization or patching. The only vulcanization involved therein with the production of this face blank was just to cure the entire thing. Whereas with the Type A and all previous TISO masks, it was comprised of several different patches of rubber which were layered together and then vulcanized as one piece. Because if you may recall, the Type A has this nice little chin seam along the bottom there, and if you look very closely, you can see registration marks of the eyepiece platforms which were patched in, and obviously the Type B was just one solid piece of dip molded black rubber. So it didn't need any of this multi-layer construction of the Type A and early American TISO style masks. So, that being said, the Type B was modern for that respect. It also paid a great deal in consideration for ergonomics and comfort, given the fact that it did use not only use an upgraded 6-point head harness, but you can also may be able to tell, this is very, very hard to see, but there was a molded ridge in the forehead so that the upper leading edge of the face blank would make that contact seal against the forehead, whereas there is this decent amount of cavity there to space the eyepieces away from the eyes and get an ample field of view. There was molded pockets for the nose and basically space for the cheeks and the internal TISO deflectors, features that we would see in subsequent injection molded masks of the 1930s, but were implemented in this design from June of 1918. The angle tube design was, a pretty typical design for the time, what we were developing with the TISO series masks, and despite its flaws, would go on to be used for several years to come with the M1 series with very slight modifications. It was overall the same basic principle used in the subsequent M1 series masks, but with the minor differences being that the flutter valve post and guard were angled a bit far too outwards. Again, something that was easily corrected when the KTM rolled around, but I digress. It just had a lot of well-rounded, very good features for the time, mainly again within the ergonomics and injection, or not injection molding, but just the dip molding and shape of the face blank as compared to, say, the Cops TISO Monroe. But again, this is an M1A1, but just same basic face piece layout and construction, where it was a flat piece of rubber that was sewn in a specific way, and with the hardware attached, would sort of fill in those gaps, because if you notice that this mask is not molded. Again, it is a flat piece of rubber that has a seam along the chin to comprise that shape to make the seal on the chin. And then also the holes for the eyepieces. Before these eyepieces are installed, they were sort of a lozenge, sort of pill shape vertically. So that way when the eyepieces were installed, it would stretch out that rubber and cause a bit of a bulge on either side to serve as the eyepiece platform that would sort of space out those eyepieces and create pressure against the temples. Whereas with the AT, because it was solidly molded, it already had those platforms molded into the rubber, and it didn't require any stress on the facepiece, although the eyepieces did cause a bit of stress to the rubber. And ultimately, every time I see an example of a Type B, they are always split between the lenses. They'll always have like a repair plaster right there. So that was another weakness of the AT, is that they were very prone to failure around the eyepieces, just due to the crude nature of these pressed aluminum CE type lenses. However, they did have an experimental clamped type of eyepiece known as the Bess eyepiece, which is made out of a curved black piece of steel in like sort of a C shape, which would clamp around the eyepiece. Where there would be a little split where the lens would sit inside this platform, and it was entirely retained with that clamped frame. And then there was another C-shaped clamp which went over the main one to retain it all in place. Again, you'd have to see pictures to know about how it fits together better. And again, you can reference my thread in the U.S. military forum for all of this. So yeah, they did actually have solutions for the problems with these CE eyepieces by the time the AT was being experimented with and trialed, but ultimately nothing became of it. And as modern and as innovative as it was, there was several key features that the Army was looking at which made the AT fall short of its adversaries. For one thing, the rubber was entirely very thin. It was no more than 2 millimeters thick, probably closer to 3 millimeters in some of the thicker spots, like around the nose bulge and cheek pouches, etc. I say cheek pouches, but they're just raised indentations to reinforce the cheeks to prevent the mask from collapsing inwards upon inhalation, but I digress again. So yeah, the main thing was that most historical references will say that the AT was too difficult to mass produce, or that the main one being, and this is the more historically accurate one to quote, is that it did not have a good seal with soldiers that had high cheekbones, cavernous temples, just basically facial pockets and deformities that would cause the mask to leak. Now, all modern masks don't really have careful attention to those types of things because they are molded with much more structurally sound rubber. So for instance, the KTM design, the reason it was set apart from the AT was that the rubber was much thicker. It was at least 3 millimeters thick on average, possibly more. I have not measured it yet, but it was significantly thicker rubber than the AT. And it didn't do anything special in terms of its molding, because obviously it was not molded. It was just a flat piece of rubber with a few reinforcements to create that shape. So why did it do better than the AT? Again, it all relies on that thicker rubber. They did not, if they had just stuck with the AT and figured out either how to slush mold the face blank or just dip mold them so that a thicker accumulation of rubber would be built up on the curing form, they would realize that having a thicker face piece would allow the mask to seal better against the temples and whatever cavernous regions of the face, because that is the main drawback of the AT, is its thin rubber. It was, again, very difficult to seal because having that lack of rigidity meant that any caverns or dimples in the face, the rubber would simply pass directly over it and not seal against it, whereas a thicker rubber would be more liable to press into those regions. And aside from this, another huge issue with the AT was its harness. It was a very good early example of a self-centering harness. However, it did not have enough points of adjustment. For as you can see here on the back, it only has 2 buckles leading from the non-elasticated cross strap on the head pad, and there was absolutely no buckles sewn anywhere else to the facepiece. Whereas with the Kops Tissot Monroe, originally it had the buckles entirely sewn onto the head pad. It had all 6 buckles, all 6 straps were adjustable, and then later with the M1 series, they attached the buckles to the facepiece, meaning that the facepiece had a wider range of adjustment to fit all gaps and crevices of the face, and that was the basic solution to that. If the designers of the AT, if William C. Gear and whoever else was working on this thing had decided to sew 6 buckles onto each harness tab attachment point of the face blank, and again, make that face blank out of thicker rubber, the AT would have blown the KTM out of the water by a long shot. It would have been significantly more difficult to produce given the fact that it was a complexly molded facepiece, and they had to do this weird stuff where they had a multi-layer of stockinette and cotton fabric tabs, and then they covered it all up with a strip of rubber along the edges. That was all unnecessary. They really didn't need to do that, as shown with the KTM design, where obviously there's no reinforcing strip of rubber, there's only 1 ply of stockinette, and the only fabric patches are on the inside of the mask to reinforce the sewing. Something interestingly that was not done on the AT, and they simply sewed right through the rubber, which, again, not the greatest design that you could do, especially when your rubber is very thin and prone to melting over time. But anyhow, yeah, there was several features that could have been improved in the AT that would have made it an ultimately superior mask to the KTM and subsequent M1 series masks. And just to recap, namely that, again, make the rubber a lot thicker, at least 3 millimeters thick. Don't do as much reinforcement along the edges, because if you use a decent quality of glue, the stockinette will hold itself in place. Add fabric patches to the back of the harness tabs, and then also add buckles to each individual harness tab to allow adjustment points on all of the straps instead of just having 2 on the back of the head pad. And these design flaws alone were the main and sole purposes the AT was rejected, and unfortunately, that it was not really considered that was why it was failed. The next logical step that William C. Gear took to improve the faults with the AT design was to develop the Goodrich Lakeside mask, which was a very good mask. It improved a lot of the flaws of the AT in other ways, but not in the ways that they could have. For instance, it used a laced skull cap head harness design similar to like a Schlem Mosca or a GP5, whatever you want to call it. It was very similar to that, and instead of having basically regions where or areas where the harness would put pressure against vulnerable leak points of the facepiece, he designed the Goodrich Lakeside to have molded in dimples, like little indentations on the inside of the facepiece that would press, like little cushions that would press against the cavernous regions of the face and allow the mask to seal better there. But it was really kind of over-engineering based on the logical design choices that a gas mask should take, whereas obviously the simple solutions that I've listed would have been ultimately the better option. And I believe that if Gear had chosen to engineer the AT in the ways of which I described, by adding those extra adjustment points and making thicker rubber, etc., it would have, again, it would have easily, without a doubt, been a much better design than the KTM/M1 series. So just a kind of an interesting thing to consider. Again, I have no real true ways to back up that claim. It is mostly based on my logical research and development type of focus, where it's like, I know how these things work. I've handled these things for upwards of close to a decade. I know these things inside and out, and I've noticed the design trends throughout history, and from a historical standpoint, this is what would work for this design. And there really isn't too much else to say other than that. And so yeah, to put it into conclusion, that's the main reasons the AT failed and why the KTM won. Is the KTM a bad mask? No, it was a very competent design, and it had its advantages of being much simpler to produce than the AT, but ultimately the AT could have been a much better mask than it was. So that being said, before I ramble on any further, and I'm sure the majority of you are probably bored or clicked away at this point, so I'm Duke with 3D. If you have any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns, drop them down in the comments below, and I'll see you all later.